The woman was healed on the Sabbath. St. Luke's, in his account of the event, tells us that at the beginning of it all, quote, she was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. But you know, the truth of the matter is, hers was not simply a physical ailment. Her spirit had been crippled as well. Everything had fallen apart and she'd lost all hope, this woman. She was trapped in that hopelessness. She was left to living inside of herself. You see, she wasn't simply bent over in some kind of physical sense. The original Greek term from which our gospel passage is translated into English, the original Greek term should be actually understood as, quote, bent together, or, quote, bent within herself. Bent within herself. And you can see that reality in the passivity that she displays in her encounter with Jesus. She didn't venture outside of herself to ask anything of Jesus. The Messiah was in her midst, and she didn't even notice. She made no move. She was paralyzed. So who initiated the interaction that took place that led to her being able to stand up straight? Not her, not in the least. It was Jesus who called her over to him. It looks like, if you just take a look at her behavior in the passage, that over the years she had become totally accustomed, resigned to the condition that she was in. What had begun as some kind of physical ailment had become her entire world. It defined her very existence. It had determined her identity to other people too, and to herself. She was, in the deepest possible sense, bent within herself. She was trapped inside herself. It had determined and limited the possibilities that she was able to see for her life. There wasn't any gaze on the majesty of mountains for her, or the stupendous sweep of the sun and the stars at night. There was only the ground at her feet. And any possibilities provided on the path before her were not present to her vision. She was locked in her own luckless, woebegone world. So Jesus, you see, was engaging a gross sort of understatement when he said of the woman that she had been bound for 18 long years. Of course, that all changed. All that changed when Jesus called her over to him. More precisely, it changed when she somehow found the courage to respond to that call and took those first few halting steps into a new future. And soon, as you just heard in the story, she was standing up straight, shouting out and giving thanks and praise to God, and finding for herself a liberated life. But the woman was unbound on the Sabbath. The time just wasn't right for her to find such freedom. And that created a problem, didn't it? At least it created a problem for the leader of the synagogue. He kept saying to the crowd, who were amazed at what had just happened, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured. Not on the Sabbath day." The leader of the synagogue was pathetic. He was just simply pathetic. He was entrapped and enclosed himself. He was trapped and enclosed in the vision and identity that he had chosen for himself to live, and in his expectation expectations and limitations that he wished to impose on others. He had lost touch with his true personhood and his relationships with those around him. The great novelist Mark Twain once made a sarcastic comment after a person he didn't like very much had passed away. Twain said to the person, "He was a good man in the very worst sense of the word." Well, the leader of the synagogue, it looks like to me, is one of those guys. Pretty insistent on telling other people what their limitations are. It turns out, you see, that there were more than one bent over person in the story you just heard. The leader of the synagogue had literally wrapped himself around his need for order and control of other people and the way they live their lives. Like the bent over person, like the bent over woman, he also was bent within himself, isolated and trapped. The sad truth of the matter is this: within each and every one of the children of God, including each and every one of the children of God who are gathered here this morning, there is both a bent over woman and a leader of the synagogue. Like the bent over woman, we let our ailments, our worries, our sometimes self-imposed limitations take our eyes off all that's really possible, all that we can and are called on to accomplish. Oh, this hip of mine. I can't do anything right now. And then, like the leader of the synagogue, we bend ourselves around our fiercely held convictions, our grievances, our resentments, our preconceptions, and our prejudices. And we're trapped. It's a stance that renders us unable to see the infinite worth of others and the transforming power of God that's present right before our eyes. So it's really good for all of us bent over folks today to fully embrace all that was taking place in that incredible experience in the synagogue on that long ago Sabbath. And we do that if and when we stand up straight and embrace all that God hopes to accomplish through us in this lonely and broken world. Back in the 19th century, in the days of colonialism, when European nations came to the continent of Africa, they, of course, as we know, carved out colonies for themselves among the peoples there. England claimed what's now the nation of Ghana, where I was blessed to spend a part of my early adult years. The French claimed the area immediately to the north of what's now Ghana, and they called that area Upper Volta. Upper Volta, maybe you've heard that term. It was called Upper Volta because it was situated in the upper reaches of the great River Volta, one of the major rivers of the continent of Africa. But you know what? That former colony, Upper Volta, it's not called that anymore. The people rose up against their French colonial masters. And after they gained their independence from France and found their freedom, they changed the name of their country. That nation is now known as Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, which means, in the language of the people there, the land of upright people. the land of upright people. They threw off colonial rule. They were liberated. They learned to stand up straight. You know, at the end of the story that we heard today from St. Luke's Gospel, the woman had learned that Jesus' power of liberation was truly, magnificently, and wonderfully real. She became, in her own way, an upright person. She was finally free. And we hope and pray in the days and weeks and months and years to come that the leader of the synagogue somehow, through the grace of God, found a similar source of freedom from what he had imposed on himself, so that he was able to stand up straight and allow other people to stand up straight themselves. And we hope and pray also, don't we, that this power will be ours as we seek to stand up and seek our own healing and liberation to achieve the full stature of personhood that we know God wants for us. It's tough. It's really tough to do that. It's tough because of all the webs of bondage that the world seeks to weave around us, and that sometimes we weave around ourselves in our need to control. It's always been this way. It has always been very difficult truly to be an upright person. When he was a young man, the great Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky was circulating literature that was banned by the Tsar. And when he was captured, caught, he was sentenced to be executed for treason. And on the day of his scheduled execution, just before it occurred, the order was rescinded. He was ecstatic and joyful, and he wrote a wonderful letter to his dear brother, in which he wrote, "To be a human being and to remain one forever, no matter in what circumstances, not to grow despondent and not to lose heart, to be willing to stand up, that's what life is all about." To be willing to stand up. That's what life's all about. Well, a century after Fyodor Dostoevsky's experience, amid a world that has failed to follow his lead, a person even younger than that very young Dostoevsky took upon her slight shoulders the eternal task to stand up. And it was one of the most courageous and dangerous acts of resistance in the history of the past century and maybe Western civilization. The act that I'm talking about was taken by Sophie Scholl. Sophie Scholl. Sophie was born in a small German town village back in 1921. She was one of the local mayor's 5 children. She was barely out of her teens, 20 years old, when her Christian faith got a hold of her and led her to take a stand against an emerging danger in German society. The unconscionable inhumanity that had wormed its way into her country's soul in the form of Nazism. She went to study at a university in Berlin, and after she'd been there just a month, she formed a group that she called the White Rose, along with her brother and some friends. It was a nonviolent resistance group of students, artists, and scientists devoted to inspiring other people to take a clear stand, against the Nazis. In their organizing document, they wrote, "Our task is to stand up and strive for the renewal of the mortally wounded German spirit. To stand up. In February of 1943, Sophie, her brother Hans, and their friend Christoph were arrested by the Gestapo. After a farce of a show trial the very same day, the three young people were found guilty of treason, and they were all three immediately beheaded by guillotine. Sophie was 21 years old. A friend remembered the last words that she spoke as she made her way to her executioner. How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to stand up individually for a righteous cause? It is such a splendid sunny day, and I have to go. But how many have to die in these days? How many young, promising lives? What does my death matter if by my acts thousands are warned and alerted to stand up? To stand up. Jesus is constantly calling all of us to stand up, to make a difference, to witness to righteousness and truth. Truth. There have always been, and there will always be, those like the leader of the synagogue lurking around who say that time is not right, that truth doesn't matter. And there'll always be ailments and internal limitations of doubt and despair that cause us to think that it's really not quite the right time for us to venture forth. So many forces conspire to keep us bent over, passive recipients, to remain bent within ourselves. You know what I say to all this? Here's what I say. Stand up. Grow a spine. Make a difference. Take a stand for genuine truth. I hope and pray that, like the woman in the gospel who was bent within herself, we'll be given the grace to let go of all that binds us, to stand up straight, lift up our eyes to the heavens, and give praise to our Savior, to gain our freedom from whatever it is that's conspiring to entrap us. It always has been, and it always will be, an absolute miracle whenever that takes place in our lives.